Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to this podcast where we talk about stuff that get us excited about tech in general, but more broadly about things that get us really excited. So today I'm joined by Oskar and Jonas from Empiric Network, who are building an Oracle network on top of Starknet. I don't know, guys, if you want to briefly introduce what you guys do at Empiric.
Yeah, I think, it is an Oracle network on top of Starknet. I mean, we would like to add, we were sort of the first live Oracle on Starknet, and now we are the leading Oracle here. I think what's interesting with what we do is we go way beyond mere price feeds. And I think that's something that is enabled by ZK rollups and by on-chain computation that you get on Starknet. What that gets you is more interesting data on-chain. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to sort of talk more about what that means and what it enables and why it is very exciting. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So, let's start. Can you tell us a bit more about what your background story is? Where do you guys come from? What did you study? And how did you end up founding Empiric?
Okay.
Oskar, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Germany originally. So I grew up sort of in the German sort of countryside, suburbia, outside of Cologne. Ended up going to, in high school, was very, very interested in a very specific sort of field within economics, behavioral economics. Turned out I couldn't study that anywhere in German university. So
why is it a very small field, or like?
Well, it's not it's a big field now, I would say, but German university is just very sort of regulated, or like very sort of, if you want to be an engineer, you go straight to engineering school. If you want to be a doctor, you go straight to med school. And within those, the curriculum is very sort of like stiff. Like you can't just study whatever you want within those fields. You just kind of have to follow the usual curriculum. And so
there's no research and things like that?
No, there is, but I wanted to have sort of more freedom. I wanted to do like very particular, specific things, and came across the liberal arts sort of model in the US, right, where you can just sort of study whatever you want. You can take any course you want, and thought that was great. And so ended up going to the US for college when I was 18, moved to Boston. Ended up going to Harvard there, where I also met Jonas. And then we actually met in a behavioral economics class. Went to the US, which was a rather interesting experience as a European, as a German, but was fantastic.
Wait, so you were in the US in Harvard?
Yeah.
Sorry for asking, which city?
That's in Boston, or Cambridge, outside of Boston. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So in the beginning, when I was thinking about going to the US, everyone would always ask me, oh, why would you leave Germany? I always said, well, because of the weather, right? Like, wouldn't it be great to go to California or something? And then I ended up in Boston, which is, of course, even worse weather than Germany. So everyone was like, well, what was up with that? But ended up going there, had some great years there. Then actually ended up dropping out of Harvard after my third year. I had already taken a time off in between to work for another blockchain startup.
Which one?
And then it was called Luther Systems. It was sort of in the process automation space. So it wasn't necessarily DeFi or crypto. And then decided to leave to pursue Empiric full time. Seemed
awesome.
Like a choice at the time, so we'll see whether in a year I say the same, but hopefully I will.
Nice. Cool. What about you, Jonas? I think you're also from Germany, right?
Yeah, funny coincidence. So Oskar and I actually, as you mentioned, met in the US. We met at Harvard, but we both from Germany. I'm actually from a different part of Germany. I'm from Berlin. So I grew up there, and also different to Oskar, grew up bilingual and bicultural. So my mother's American, my father's German. So I always spoke both languages at home, and went to a German-American school, and also had spent time in the US before Harvard. So I I spent 2 years working at a big Silicon Valley VC before I went to Harvard. My story at Harvard is went very, very deep on the academic side. For me, it wasn't behavioral economics. For me, it was cognitive science and sort of human and artificial intelligence. So went very deep into the academics there. Actually,
can you talk a bit more about it?
Yeah, helped Steven Pinker teach a 300-person class. Did research actually just a week ago. One of the papers that I'm the first author on was published in a scientific journal. So lots of exciting.
That's a huge achievement, right?
Thank you.
Who knows what that paper was about, right?
Jonas knows.
Whatever. Jonas knows. Lots of exciting academics, and got a very deep look at that. What would that be like to do a PhD? The field was sort of all about thinking. So how humans do it, how machines do it, and then what the two can learn from one another. So humans can learn from some things from machines, but humans are also much, much better at other things than even our best algorithms are today. So there's a give and a take there that's very, very interesting. And ultimately decided that I'd rather go into industry. So also then spent a year working at an AI machine learning startup that was focused on productionizing machine learning models. So a lot of machine learning is sort of research and development focused tinkering. And what we built is software that helps bring those to production and make them be really useful in the real world.
Wow, this sounds fascinating. I'm not super familiar with the field of AI, but I meet a lot of enthusiastic people. And I also meet a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about AI who end up switching to blockchain. There are probably people on the other way also, but I get to meet them less.
So the funny thing I always tell people is sort of when I talk about what I'm doing now with Empiric, they're like, oh, you fell down the rabbit hole, you completely switched tracks. And I say, yes, but also, Empiric is cool because it's sort of both worlds, right? It's both the data world and it's the blockchain world. And in many ways, sort of what I've done in the past at building data products at the VC, machine learning products. Also, I've spent time at Palantir building data products there. It all informs and is not that dissimilar from the data product that we're building in Empiric.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm in a house right now on the Upper West Side with a couple of our friends from MIT who are actually building an ML startup, like machine learning startup. And I'm like, every day I'm like, you guys should be working on this instead. Come on. So I'm trying hard, and I feel like there is a lot of overlap actually between those two communities. So yeah.
Very nice. So can you tell us, Jonas, when did you first hear about crypto?
Yeah.
More interestingly, how?
Yeah. So I first heard about crypto in 2016. I was actually working at the VC in Silicon Valley at the time, and it was a funny time. I'll tell two stories here. The first story is it was a funny time because this was the ICO boom, and so this was one of the first very big bull markets. And
so you leave the ICO boom from a VC's perspective?
Exactly, which was crazy.
That must have been funny.
We were quaking in our boots for all of 2 weeks. Everybody was afraid, like, they're not going to need VCs anymore. Henri, you have no idea. There were presentations made about what do we add in addition to money. And people sort of started preparing their pitch for like, what do we offer that an ICO can't? People were really afraid because they were like, this is the new way that young projects will have access to capital. And they don't need the gatekeepers of the old world. They don't need venture capitalists. Now, it turns out 2 weeks later, we found out, well, actually, having someone do a lot of due diligence is maybe a good thing. So there were a lot of rugs in that ICO phase. And then the other thing is, the SEC came in and for better or worse said that many of the things that were going on were not allowed. So that was quite an interesting time to see from the VC perspective. And then the other thing,
changed anything? Like, do you think it was just like a small parenthesis in time where we thought, we're all gonna die? Actually, no. Or did it change things on the long term? Like, did it change the way VCs did things?
No. Okay. Cynically, no. I was also the VC that I was at was not crypto native or crypto focused in any way. I'm sure there were sort of out of that came crypto focused VCs that sort of did that area. But I would say the average sort of large Silicon Valley VC didn't sort of drastically change their operations after this. And so the other thing that happened at that time, the other story that was sort of one of my first crypto stories, was actually meeting at a Node.js conference that I went to as a scout for the VC firm, meeting the team behind Storch. And so that was really fascinating to me, sort of with a bunch of the math cryptography background that I had at the time, understanding how exactly their product is built, how they achieve encryption and sharding of the files that they store. And then that means sort of at the end, by distributing that, you get better uptime, faster ingress and egress, and cheaper storage, which is like, those are the three things that you care about if you store something. So that was a really, really cool technology and a really cool use case in very, very early days. And so just talking with the team there.
Yeah, in 2016, they did their, I don't know if it was the first or second ICO, right? But I know they raised money at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So they were talking to VC firms and considering ICO. We unfortunately, in my mind, did not end up investing. I think part of the reason was sort of, it was what now is much more common in terms of token warrants and sort of those kind of structures, which at the time for most VCs was completely novel and just a little too scary from a regulatory perspective for someone who's used to investing in equity only. But that was sort of a first deep dive, learning from the team there what they had built and seeing, back sort of to what I think I'm very interested in, and it's also a data startup, I think not coincidentally, is sort of the applications of this technology to create very much new products that were not possible elsewhere that have intrinsic utility.
What I find really interesting with blockchain technologies in general, and it follows a bit what you're saying, is that they're very much an engineering creature. I mean, there are a few new discoveries and new paradigms and new cryptographic primitives that come up, but not that much. They're really just like engineers taking different stuff, mashing them up together, and boom, something new comes up. And anyway, I like the way you describe storage, and it reminds me a bit of that. Oskar, how did you first hear about crypto?
Good question. I was thinking about this. I actually don't know. Like, it was probably just like the news in like 2017, something like that.
What was the first time you thought like, oh wow, this looks interesting?
Well, I remember the first time thinking, wow, this is super weird, which was when I think the Winklevoss twins, the twins that somehow were involved in Facebook, I don't know, like in the beginning. I remember like reading a headline, maybe like in 2017 or 18, something like that, where they now had like bought all this Bitcoin and now they had become like even richer. And I thought, oh, this was like a weird thing. And then it sort of was sort of sparked my interest and looked into it more. I think one thing that I really remember in the beginning that really bothered me about it was people would always talk about Bitcoin as a currency, and they would talk about like a fixed supply, right? Like there's that many Bitcoin, or there will be that many Bitcoin. And they always talked about how it was sort of a hedge against inflation, or like somehow like a currency that would experience no inflation or deflation. And that always bothered me as sort of an economist. I ended up, having to take some macroeconomics classes, and I feel like, pretty quickly you learn that if you have sort of a fixed supply, and this might be somewhat controversial, but I think from what I've read, this is rather reasonable. If you have a fixed supply of a currency, but you have economic up and downturns, you actually experience much more inflation and deflation, because you have, a fixed amount of currency that represents now either more or less stuff depending on how the economy is doing. So anyway, I just remembered sort of that thing. I was thinking, well, why are people talking about this inflation point so much? And for me, sort of crypto is much more than just that. I think there are ways to create better currencies that do not experience inflation and deflation like we are in the real world today, or in the fiat world. But I think it's more interesting to think about things beyond just money and sort of fiat substitutes, right? Like, what are the new the new programs you can build, what are the new protocols you can build, what are the new services you can offer in much, much better ways. And so, that's, I think, also where Starknet is taking us into a world where we can actually do much, much more now with blockchain, much, much more now with sort of trustless systems. But yeah, so I don't have like as nice of an answer as Jonas, but it was sort of. I was
pretty cool. Don't worry.
Yeah, I sort of just like became more and more aware of it. Yeah.
So do you remember what was the first application you used on a chain? Like, what was your first interaction with the chain? Was it sending money? Was it using Uniswap? Any kind of DeFi app?
Well, in the beginning, like, obviously, you first need to on-ramp. And so, the first interaction was probably Kraken or like Coinbase or something like that. And I remember, like, I early on tried to buy like some sort of NFT or something stupid like that. And it did not work. Like, I kid you not. It was like the hardest thing I'd done all week. And it did not work. And then it somehow worked. But like the transaction maybe went through or maybe it didn't. And it was like extremely expensive. And it was sort of, one could say probably at that moment that it was clear to me that, it's probably an infrastructure phase that we're in. And we need to sort of build better infrastructure. And we can't just, lay back and now think about cool applications, because nothing worked literally nothing worked. And it was very, very, very difficult in my experience.
Yeah, you could make a point that nothing really works today also. I mean, like the base layer works. You can obviously exchange value in for some power users it works, but it's
Empiric works really well. but I mean, like
you could make the point that if a network is usable just by a few thousand people, or a few dozen thousand, which is the case today for most blockchain networks, like, does it really work? If a product is usable just by a tiny fraction of the population, does it really work? I mean, it kind of does, but there's a lot of things still to be built.
And that, I agree with that, right? And that is exactly why we are building in the corner that we're building in, which is, of course, ZK rollups and Starknet, because our, I think, conviction is that, at 14 TPS on mainnet, even with the activity you have there, it's just not, sort of meaningless in the bigger picture at this point. And we need to get much, much better in a couple of dimensions. And so that's why we decided to kind of try to contribute to that and try to contribute really good data infrastructure and data products to hopefully enable sort of the next generation of protocols that will actually be useful to sort of real people.
So I'm curious, did you come up saying like, okay, so these networks, ZK rollups are interesting, and did you think, okay, let's try to build something there, oracles are needed? Or did you have a sort of affinity for data and oracles? Jonas, you mentioned that you obviously have a background with data, so I'm guessing there's something there, but how did you approach building an oracle network?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think Oskar and I have been working together for, I think, almost two years now, but for the last year, spent a lot of time looking into ZK rollups and thinking through sort of, as you two were just talking about, okay, this is the status quo, only a few thousand people can use it. Where's the solution coming from? What technologies are we seeing that are exciting? And how do we collectively as a technological community push things forward so that we have those solutions? And it was pretty quickly clear to us that ZK rollups are the place to be. And then it was just a question of thinking through sort of, okay, within that, there's obviously Starknet and a few others. What are the infrastructure parts on top of that, right? If you have a ZK rollup, that's already a fantastic step, but there's also other building blocks that are needed. And so which of those building blocks are have yet to be put in place? Where can we help, basically, was sort of what we were thinking through. And actually, our first project on Starknet was not the Oracle. 6 months ago, we built the name service, which was another sort of result of talking to a bunch of people in the ecosystem, such as Gyoza, who had built sort of a first version of this for his game, and thinking through, what are the building blocks, as we move people over. It's going to be very, very useful to have them not just, refer to each other with their addresses, but actually have handles. And so wallets will want this, payment services will want this. And this is critical to making the UX better for onboarding all of those people. And so that was one of the first things we started building, is just, how do we get, obviously ENS has done an amazing job on the layer one, but what does that look like for Starknet? And I think there the story, as with Empiric, is yes, we can copy paste what we have elsewhere, but one of the things that Oskar and I enjoy doing and think is extremely important to do is to also rethink from first principles, how can we do better?
That's right.
What do you think you can do better?
Well, yeah, hopefully a couple of things. I mean, right, this always strikes me as interesting when we talk about ZK rollups, when people talk about sort of maybe VM compatibility and things like that. It's like, we're not trying to just like build the exact same things, right, that we build on the L1. Like that would be a pretty sad kind of scenario forever, where we're just sort of in this loop of rebuilding the things that we've already done somewhere else. I think the big question for us was, okay, ZK rollups make a lot of sense. You're introducing this new part to the equation, which is zero knowledge proofs. It makes sense to sort of treat the L1 as sort of the security layer. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So this probably will happen. We are fairly confident. If that happens, what actually changes, right? So what changes is really three things, I would say. It's lower gas, it's much higher TPS, and then the third thing is you get the ability to do just about any computation on chain. And so that third part is actually extremely interesting and extremely important to an oracle. And so that gets us.
What's really funny, what I find really funny about what you're saying, like I totally agree, but it's really funny because we are repeating the exact same mistake. It's a tiny point. We are making the exact same mistake as people before, in the fact that we're using terms to designate things that are not really exactly what it means. When you say we're doing computation on chain, are you really in a ZK rollup? You're not really doing the computation on chain. You're doing it outside of the chain and verifying it on chain. And so anyway, I just wanted to underline this because it's funny. I think a lot of people would say like, yeah, sure, you're doing a lot of computation on chain. How does that scale? Well, sure, it's harder to understand because when you understand that computation is done elsewhere and you're verifying it and you're authenticating the result on chain, makes a bit more sense, but we don't have the terms for that yet. I'm sorry, I interrupted. So
maybe in this podcast, we just need to start like, coming up. Maybe after every podcast, you should just like send around a list of 5 things. This is like what everyone has to use now.
Okay, but no, let's redefine all these terms.
Exactly. No, that might be a good idea actually. I'll send you a list after. No, but okay, that's right. Now, with that new ability comes new interesting things you can do on chain, of course. And so the most interesting thing that we found is, we can now go beyond just mere price feeds in terms of what we give our protocols. So if you take a step back and if you think about data on chain today, what do you have? Okay, you have the price of ETH, you have the price of Bitcoin, and that's sort of many things depend on that. If you look at traditional financial markets, it's not like 2 price feeds sort of are all deterministic. Like it's not like they rule sort of the entire space. You have many other very interesting, very important different data feeds that are actually everywhere. And so 3 that we've identified are yield, volatility, and risk. So you go to your bank or you go trade on the stock market, whatever it is. There is no way that you can do just about any transaction without touching one of those 3. Yet, none of those are in DeFi today. And the reason is those are computational products, right? Like if you think about volatility is different to a price feed. You can't just sort of ask an exchange, oh, what is the volatility? Like there's many different types of volatility of different assets, of a different time frames and all of that. That is a computational product. You compute something to get that. For the very first time now, we can do that, say, on chain, and we can do it in a verifiable way. And we can give you those metrics in a verifiable way, which is really interesting because I think it will help us to solve some of the biggest problems that we have today in DeFi and crypto. Right? Think about over-collateralized loans. Over-collateralized loans, that problem is about risk assessment, about knowing what your collateral is. Right? For example, what we're working on right now is giving you a volatility feed for the asset that you would take in as collateral. So you can say, oh, this is actually very volatile collateral, or maybe not. Depending on which one it is, you might want to set the liquidation points somewhere else, right? Or if you do multi-collateral loans or something like that, you want to know what the correlation between the two collateral assets is, right? Like maybe if one goes up, the other one goes down, that would be a great combination, would make for great collateral. So those things, I think, will ultimately help us get to better DeFi products that are more sophisticated and that are actually useful, right? Like where my mom would actually go and like get a loan, like a DeFi loan, and not go to like Bank of America anymore. But like she's certainly not going to like on-ramp some sort of fiat into crypto today and then like go to like Aave or Compound, even that's not going to happen. So I think what you need is higher TPS, lower gas, but you need really also much better data and much more insightful data to power sort of more sophisticated products that are actually useful.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Jonas, any particular insight on what kind of data you think would be interesting to have on chain?
Yeah, I think Oskar's covered a bunch of them. I mean, I think there's also the whole world, and Oskar touched on some of this. There's the whole world of sort of beyond DeFi. What kind of applications are there here? And I think that's something very, very exciting. Whether that's weather data, bringing weather data on chain. Actually, last week at the hackathon, we had someone bring weather data on chain to do sort of a weather prediction market. And the same thing is true for sports data, which is actually my personal favorite. I think if you look at sort of it's funny because it's a US phenomenon, is as far as I know, is fantasy sports, where the idea is you sort of create your own team out of real world players, or you determine sort of which teams you think will win and go how far. And then your friends do the same, and then you sort of compete both for the bragging rights of who had the best choice, but also in sometimes small amounts of money with friends. And so I think, right, if you look at just plain old sports betting, this is already a gamified version of this, where it's social, it's with friends. That's why it's so much. It's really fun and much more mainstream, I would say, than just regular sports betting. And I think you can take that a step further and build entire sort of on-chain game ecosystems around these players or real world entities. And then you can feed that and bring in an element of unpredictability, of sort of, again, connection to the real world and engagement for the average person, which isn't just its own virtual world, but has that tie to the real world. And sports data is one example of that. I mean, weather data features in these games as well, right? Redline is doing very interesting things with that and bringing in that element of sort of, it's not just an element of randomness, it's an element of changingness and randomness, but in a way where the fact that it changes in a way that corresponds to the real world adds a layer of sort of interesting flavor.
Very nice. So you have an extensive background in data science. And as you mentioned, Empiric is kind of linking blockchain and data science. I'm curious, in the field of data science and artificial intelligence, do you see any convergence soon, like in the short term or in the longer term? Do you think this is we've seen some example of neural nets being verified on Starknet. Do you think this is something that has value, verifiable neural networks?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the projects that actually we've worked with as well as Giza, which is doing super cool things on Starknet with bringing machine learning models on chain. I would say there's sort of two different angles to this. I think one of the angles is exactly that. So is thinking through, 4 use cases that today run on Web 2 infrastructure. Which of those running on Web 3 infrastructure would be powerful? And so here, I think the key value adds that Web 3, that a decentralized network can bring, is robustness and is transparency, right? And so robustness, I mean, this was our job at my last startup, was robustness. So we, built on AWS, and our goal was to make a service that would never go down. So we had on call and all of these things. But obviously, if you deployed on something like Starknet, your DevOps sort of is outsourced, and you wouldn't have to worry about that. So that's the robustness angle, and then the transparency angle is very interesting as well, which is a lot of what we worked on is trying to make these models explainable and trying to make it easy to understand. When I give it these inputs and then something happens, what is the output? Whether that's a boosted tree or a neural network that's doing the prediction. And there, I think the main thing that verifiable computation gets us is just the transparency that you can prove with these inputs. I ran these computations and got this output. And so I think those are probably the main two angles for Web 2 use cases. And then the second big category is Web 3 use cases. So, right, we can sort of use Web 3 technology to solve Web 2 use cases, which is the first thing I was talking about. And then the second thing is, well, where within Web 3, now that we have cheap computation, can we make our applications smarter? And where can we use data to help them learn from the past and predict the future? And so I think we're thinking through some of those things. I think, for example, vaults and automated on-chain strategies is going to be one of the first areas to adopt this, just because it's solidly within DeFi, and there's a very clear use case. I don't think it's like extremely fancy machine learning, but I think a few sort of linear regression type of models would already, this is the story of ML. Start with a simple thing.
Exactly. It's not like there's a lot of libraries on, like, if you want verifiable computation, you need to write your models in Cairo. So it's not like there's a lot of libraries already. So if you want to do verifiable machine learning, we'll have to rewrite all of this from scratch, which I think is a long-term effort.
Yep. That's exactly right.
So you guys studied liberal arts, right, in Harvard?
Liberal arts, yeah. Or as my parents would say, nothing at all.
So do you study programming in liberal arts? Sorry, like you studied behavioral economics, macroeconomics. How did you end? Like, do you guys program now? How did you end up programming?
Well, liberal arts just sort of has a little bit of context. Liberal arts is sort of the idea that you should do one thing in depth, but then you should also sort of do a lot of other things a little bit. This was not pitching it too much. If someone heard this, they would say, "Oh my god!" But no, it's like sort of you have to do a little bit.
The metaphor they use is should be T-shaped. So there should be a big sort of at the top, the crossbar. You should know a lot of things a little bit, and then you have one thing like a T where you go very deep. And so liberal arts, for me, the focus was computer science. So what I went very, very deep on was cognitive science and computer science. So took a lot of advanced computer science, algorithms classes, statistics classes, and actually took the cryptography class, which is how, funnily enough, through the professor who I stayed in touch with, we actually got introduced to Ellie almost a year ago now. So there's funny threads there.
But I think that's kind of the cool thing, which is like, you can sort of do you can focus on one thing, but you can still take like whatever CS classes or math classes or philosophy classes, right? You could take as many religion classes as you can fit in as well. So it just gives you a lot of freedom to explore. One thing I'll just say on this is, in the beginning they ask people like, oh, what do you actually want to study? Like when they just come to Harvard, and 70% of people say one thing and then actually end up studying something completely different because they go to college and find out, oh, hold on a minute, I actually don't want to be a priest. I actually want to be an engineer or whatever it is. It always strikes me as probably pretty problematic that, for example, in Germany, we force people to make that decision right after high school. Well, like you actually haven't had the chance yet to really explore what you would want to do and all of those things. So, it's one of those things that I think the US system actually has gotten right.
Nice. And do you think what leads to this kind of decision is the topic that people want to study or the teacher teaching it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in my experience, actually, I'm curious to hear your opinion, Jonas. In my experience, sort of, a good teacher can make like a bad, or an uninteresting topic really interesting. A bad teacher can make a really interesting topic nothing at all as well. So I think the teacher is actually very impactful. Yeah. And so I think we were both lucky that we had some great teachers at Harvard. Some of the professors that we had, even like the professor in whose course we actually met, remains, I think, a sort of a friend and mentor to this day. So that's really valuable. Yeah.
Very nice. So right now, most of the community of Web3 and the blockchain space, most of it happens online, right? Which is funny because in comparison to what we're saying, it's not like there's one teacher of Web3. There are thousands of them because we all learn from the internet. And so
no, there's only Ellie.
Yeah, no, you're right. There are a few teachers who are very prominent in the space, and Ellie is one of them, of course. But what I mean is I think most blockchain developers today, or people who are in the space, didn't learn it through a class or a teacher. They learned it through reading random blog posts and looking at weird podcasts and reading comments on Reddit. And so it's a really online community, and that's interesting because I don't know, it says something about the topic itself. When you guys got into it, I'm guessing most of it was behind a computer, right? You read about it, then you got into it, found the resources. Do you remember what were your first in real life interactions with the community? Because after a while, you think, oh, there's a meetup near my house. Maybe I'll go. Or, hey, there's this conference. Or, hey, there's this guy who lives not so far. Let's talk. Do you remember what were your first in real life interactions?
That's a really good question. Jonas, do you know what it was for you? I mean, for you, it was probably 2016, 17, right?
Yeah, I mean, I stumbled into these people at the Node.js conference, and then hung out a bunch with them in person.
Were you looking for them, or did you just randomly stumble on them?
No, I just randomly stumbled. I mean, one of the things that you do as a VC is you try to find interesting projects that you can hopefully help. And a great place to go look for ones is at conferences. So that's where I met them. So that was an IRL experience.
It sounded like a nice experience. No, I mean, like from what you discussed earlier, it sounded like a great talk and nice people.
Always Absolutely. Go to conferences. Always go to conferences. Magic happens at conferences. For me, it was probably, let me think. Actually, what happened to me was during COVID, no one could be on campus. So I was still in college. So I said, okay, this makes no sense. Like, college in the US makes no sense if that means I have to sit at home in my high school bedroom, in Germany with like 6 hours time difference. Like that's not going to, that's going to be horrible. So I should look for something else to do during that year. And so I ended up working for that startup in London that I mentioned. And it wasn't like it was sort of more similar to what you did, Henri, like before you joined Starknet. So it was more sort of like working with big companies and thinking about how they can actually use blockchain to automate some of their processes and so on. But that was sort of my first exposure to the space. And it was sort of probably the opposite of a conference, because it was just like me and sort of this company of 15 people. And, everyone was like just thinking about, how do we design this smart contract or that smart contract? So it was sort of like pretty fundamental smart contract design without any of the sort of DeFi flavor around it, which was interesting. And then, I think the first time that I really met the Starknet community was in Amsterdam at the first hackathon. And I think that's where we also like sort of really fell in love with, the space and what you guys were doing and sort of everyone in the community. And we thought, wow, this is fantastic. We want to be part of this.
Yeah, it was nice. There was a nice energy in Amsterdam, and really good food also. The hackathon.
And I remember like I had been to East Denver a couple months before, and it was like snowing, and it was like like I'm not a huge fan of like these like American cities. And then you go to Amsterdam, it was like beautiful weather. We're like biking from one meeting to the other. It was just like the polar opposite. And it was overall like a fantastic experience. Yeah.
Very nice. So you guys have been in Web3 for a bit of time, and in the Starknet community for, time flies. It feels like you've always been there, but Amsterdam was like 4 months ago. One of my questions was, what did you see change for good and for bad?
In the 4 months,
so there's not a lot to see.
Your beard got longer.
I work in cycle. It's mostly you don't see it that much with my beard, but I cut my hair until they get too large and too hot, especially during summer. I let it grow.
Okay, let me scare you. Your French accent is slowly fading away. No, I'm just kidding. It's nice. as strong as ever. Don't worry.
I can always bring it back if you want. I know it's very demanded. People seem to like it.
Cairo, yeah,
it's quite funny. I don't say Cairo. I say Cairo. I don't know who started with Cairo, but I might go along with it.
I think it's Uri who is just pretending to be French at times, and so that's where he came from.
He tends to do that.
But no, on a more substantial note. The one big thing that has changed on Starknet, and I say this sort of trying to be with humility, but I think it's still true, is that when we started looking into it, which was sort of when Starknet really got started, there was none of the foundational pieces in place, right? There was no naming service, and there was Origin had just sort of started with the wallet. Now there's Origin and Bravos, and Bravos is doing all of these great things that are very specific to Starknet as well. So what I'm trying to say is, I think what really has changed for Starknet is that now you have a lot of those infrastructure building blocks that anyone would need to start a protocol. And of course, we think 6 months ago there wasn't a good Oracle, and now there is with us. So I think that's really exciting, right? You just see how like the ecosystem is sort of being built from the ground up. But now we're at a point, I think, where anyone can come over and can find a lot of those foundational pieces in place and can just start building things much more easily. And so that's really exciting. And I think that's going to accelerate innovation and sort of activity by a lot, is my belief.
What I really like is also that most of these libraries and tools are built by the community itself. And there's very much the spirit, like if this tool doesn't exist, then build it, and people actually pick up the stuff and do it. And I think it's like it says a lot about the builders in this community. So we talked about the last 6 months. What do you think is important, and how do we cultivate our dev community going forward in the next 6 months to build something that people want to build on and users want to use? Jonas, do you have any idea of things you want to see emerge?
Yeah,
so your wish list.
I'll give an answer that sort of ties into what Oskar said, which is I think there comes a time in and around an inflection point in a community like Starknet, which I think you can argue that sort of this has happened in the last few weeks. You can argue that it's happening now. You can argue that it will happen in a few more weeks. But I think there comes a time where a simple Telegram channel won't suffice to coordinate among all the moving parts, because it just gets too big, and word of mouth and sort of the 100 people that are all very, very active and spend all day here knowing one another and communicating one to one where is relevant, that starts to fall apart. And that's why I think that's something that we've started to see with shamans, with the documentation, with a lot of these sort of, I think a nice way to phrase it is sort of community driven hubs in and around the community, places where people can congregate, because as the dev community grows, it becomes coordination starts to become a real problem. And so I think building the tools to make that happen is going to be very, very important, that people know what other people are working on, that people know what are the emerging standards, right? I think the Open Zeppelin repo here is great. The SIMPs, right, also recently introduced, is another sort of step in that direction of coordination on a larger scale, because it's not 100 devs anymore that can all talk to one another. So I think that's sort of on the dev community side one of the biggest things. I don't know that I have like a list of here are the 3 things that I don't think are being done right now. I think probably in each of the important things there are ongoing projects. I think the big question is, where there are multiple ones, how do they specialize and sort of find their own niche and contribute something that's different from what others are contributing and still extremely valuable. And then the other question is sort of who is building that out, and where, as time progresses, do we see gaps, and where do we say, these three projects are all important, but actually the second one is falling behind because the community needs this so much. And then who steps up and fills in that gap and sort of pushes things forward. And so that's something where I think we as Empiric want to do a lot more going forward, and sort of helping build out those tools, as we transition as well from, builders of infrastructure to also more generally thinking about, okay, how does everyone win by getting this ecosystem to be what we want it to be?
Yeah.
Great. Well, really interesting. Really interesting. And I do agree with you. I think there's a lot to think about in how we give the community the skeleton it needs to grow bigger.
Yeah. But I think I think what Jonas is saying is actually really interesting, which is sort of like resonates and makes me think of a couple of other things. Basically, like, okay, in the beginning in Amsterdam, we were like that many people, and now in Paris, where we just last week, we're already like at Starknet CC, right? You had like 450, 500 people, so it's already much bigger, and it's going to continue to go like that. I think once you hit a certain point, actually you end up, it becomes impossible to know the entire ecosystem. And actually what happens is that far fewer people. And so there's this idea of like Dunbar's number, which is 150 people. Once any community exceeds that number, the people that you actually really know collapses down. And so what that means for us, I think, as a community is thinking through how do we onboard people really well. And Jonas mentioned this, but sort of like your tutorials are great, and sort of like more advanced versions of that. I know Only Dust is working on something like that. I think those things will become more and more important, because not everyone will have the experience that we had, where we came in, knew the entire ecosystem very quickly, and everyone sort of helped us get up to speed. Right, that is going to become harder and harder. And so, yeah,
I think it's something like. Yeah. I know it's kind of a pipe dream, but I wish we could do that. Some kind of mentoring program, each one teach one. That could bring us far, but I'm not sure exactly how we should structure it. And there's also the thing that, it's not always fun to mentor people, but it is. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. And having a program that allows newcomers to come in contact with old-timers, old being 6 months old, of course, but with people who are experienced, and giving people who are 6 months old, people who are already experienced, like giving them the incentive or making them want to help newcomers. I think it's not that easy, but if we manage it could be really cool.
I think that's a great point, and I think that's something that we experienced, right, to a certain extent. Like people like Guilty Guza, who happened to, he was sort of around Cambridge when we started thinking about things as well. Because obviously he was also at Harvard before he dropped out of his PhD program. Like that was great for us, right? That was absolutely fantastic and really inspired us as well. Like you talked about sort of the inspiration for this podcast to be sort of what inspires people, what are your interests and so on. I think it's very powerful if you have someone who's sort of quote unquote an expert, or who's done interesting things to tell you about what's possible. Like that conveys much more than you're just sort of like reading a blog post, even though the blog post might be great. But yeah, if you can come up with sort of a systematic way of doing that, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
I know you guys are organizing a meetup in New York City soon, right?
Yeah, if you come, well, yeah. We can. We actually, I feel like we know quite a couple of people here who are either building on Starknet or who want to. There's obviously the entire Starknet house. Organized by Topology, who are doing a fantastic job with that. So yeah, slowly we see a community growing on this side of the Atlantic as well, which is exciting.
Super cool. Guys, I think we've reached the end of my questions. Thanks a lot for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation. Do you want to, where do people find more information about Empiric?
They can probably go on empiric.network as our website, read up there, or read about us on Medium, or go on our Twitter, which is also empiric.network, and they'll find out more there. Yeah.
Cool. Twitter's just Empiric Network. One other thing I'll add is we also have a Discord channel within the Starknet Discord. So for people who are already sort of in there learning about Starknet, it's easy to hop over and ask any questions. We watch that and are happy to help answer questions.
So this is where I go if I want to request a feed with the price of Lebanese hummus in Nigeria in a
exactly
minute resolution.
We talked about this already. We already have that. Come on. But exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, always good to chat.
Thanks, Henri.
See you, Henri. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Cheers.
Ciao.